The dust was the first thing you knew in the morning and the last thing you tasted at night. It was the grit between your teeth, the film on your skin, the pale ghost that haunted the canvas of the wagon. Out on the plains of Wyoming, the dust was a living thing, stirred to a ceaseless dance by a sun that showed no mercy. The sky was a vast, bleached-out blue, an ocean of emptiness that pressed down on the 20-odd wagons of the train, making them seem as small and fragile as beetles crawling across a dinner plate. The only music was the groan and creak of the wheels, a sound that worked its way into a man's bones until he heard it in his sleep. It was a monotonous complaint, the sound of wood and iron straining against the unyielding earth. The land itself was the true master of this journey. It was immense, a sea of brown grass and sagebrush that rolled onto an eternity of horizon, broken only by distant, hazy buttes that shimmered like apparitions in the heat. It was a beautiful country, in a way a man could only appreciate when he was not fighting it for his life. It was stark and clean and honest, offering no false promises of comfort. It was indifferent, and in its indifference, there was a kind of terrible majesty. The people who crawled across its face felt their own insignificance with every mile, with every sunrise that brought no relief, and every sunset that promised only a different kind of darkness. Inside one of the larger wagons, insulated from the worst of the sun but not from the suffocating heat, sat Ilara Vance. The rhythmic lurch and sway of the wagon had become the cadence of her life, a constant, unsettling motion that mirrored the turmoil in her own heart. She held a small, oval photograph in a tarnished silver frame, the edges worn smooth by the fretful touch of her fingers. It showed a man and a woman, their faces stiff and unsmiling in the way of old portraits, but their eyes held a warmth that Ilara could no longer find in their letters. Her parents, the authors of her fate. She was not an excited bride-to-be, blushing with anticipation. She was a sacrifice, a lamb being led to an altar in a town she had never seen, to be given to a man she had never met. The name Alistair Finch was a stranger's name, a collection of letters that represented not a person, but a transaction. Back in Philadelphia, the Vance family name, once spoken with respect in the finest parlors, had become a hushed scandal. Her father's investments, once the source of their comfort, had crumbled into nothing, leaving behind a chasm of debt and disgrace. Mr. Finch, a man of considerable wealth and influence in a place called Redemption Bluff, had offered a solution. He would have a young, cultured bride from a good family, and in return, the Vance family would be saved from the poorhouse and the public shame that came with it. Ilara traced the line of her mother's jaw in the photograph. Was this what they had imagined for her when they had taught her piano and French, when they had paraded her at debutante balls in silks and lace, to be sold like livestock to the highest bidder? A profound, hollow dread had taken up permanent residence in her chest. She saw her future not as a marriage, but as a cage, a gilded one, to be sure, filled with fine things and the cold comfort of security, but a cage nonetheless. She thought of the life she had once dreamed of, a simple, quiet life with a man she might learn to love, a life filled with books and a small garden and the freedom to be herself. That dream was ash now, scattered on the winds of her family's failure. This journey, this marriage, was not a beginning. It felt like a death sentence, a slow march toward the end of everything she was, or ever hoped to be. For the better part of a day, he had been a rumor on the horizon, a lone rider, keeping a steady distance, a dark shape against the endless landscape. He did not approach, nor did he fall behind. He simply shadowed them, a silent, patient observer. To the travelers on the wagon train, he was a mystery. And mystery in this land was often another word for danger. Some of the men speculated he was a scout, though for whom, no one could say. Others, their hands resting near their firearms, muttered the word outlaw. His name was Silas Cole. Though no one on the train knew it, he was a man who seemed to have been carved from the land itself. He was lean, with the kind of spare toughness that came from having too little and wanting even less. His face was a map of sun and wind, weathered to the color of old leather, with lines etched around eyes that were the pale, watchful gray of a winter sky. He moved with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, seemed to move with his thoughts, the two of them a single, fluid entity. He carried a rifle in a scabbard beside his saddle and a pistol low on his hip, but he wore them with the ease of a carpenter wearing his hammer, as tools of a trade, not as threats. At night, when the wagons circled up and the campfires pushed back the immense darkness, Silas made his own small camp a mile or so away. He would sit with his back against his saddle, staring into the flickering flames of his fire, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. In those moments, the hard shell of his competence seemed to fall away, revealing something else, a profound loneliness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have settled in his bones. He was a man haunted by ghosts the world could not see, lost in thoughts he shared with no one but the vast, silent stars. The change began subtly, a shift in the quality of the light, a cooling of the relentless wind. The endless blue of the sky began to bleed at the edges, bruising with shades of gray and a deep, ominous purple. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of distant rain and unsettled dust. The horses grew skittish, their ears twitching, their nostrils flaring as they scented the coming storm. The wagon master, a grizzled veteran named Miller, squinted at the horizon. "Get these wagons to the cottonwoods," he bellowed, his voice straining against the rising wind. "Find what shelter you can. She is coming on fast." There was a frantic scramble, a shouting of commands and a cracking of whips, but it was too little, too late. The storm did not arrive. It fell. It was as if the bruised sky had been torn open, unleashing a biblical fury upon the plains. The rain was not a drizzle, but a solid, driving wall of water that hit the earth with the force of 1,000 drums. The dry, cracked ground, baked hard by months of sun, could not absorb the deluge. In moments, the trail turned to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Thunder exploded overhead, not as a distant rumble, but as a violent, cracking concussion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. It was followed by jagged slashes of lightning that lit the scene in stark, terrifying flashes of white, panicked faces, screaming children, horses rearing in their harnesses, their eyes wide with terror. The world descended into chaos. Wagons, their wheels finding no purchase in the slick mud, began to slide sideways. People screamed, their cries swallowed by the roar of the storm. Ilara's wagon, driven by a hired man and his wife, had been near the rear of the train, close to the edge of a shallow, rocky ravine. As the driver fought to control the terrified oxen, the ground beneath the outer wheels gave way. The wagon tilted, a slow, sickening lurch that sent everything inside crashing against the canvas wall. Ilara heard the driver's shout. A sharp cry of fear cut short. There was a moment of impossible, terrifying balance as the wagon teetered on the brink, half on the trail, half over the empty air. Then, with a great groaning of stressed wood, it plunged over the side. For Ilara, the world dissolved into a violent, churning nightmare. She was thrown from her bench like a doll, her head striking a wooden crate with a dull, sickening thud. The air was filled with the cacophony of splintering wood, the shattering of the lantern glass she had so carefully polished that morning, and her own screams, raw and desperate. The wagon did not fall cleanly. It tumbled, rolling down the rocky incline, breaking apart as it went. Then, as suddenly as it began, the motion stopped. The world was blackness, absolute, suffocating darkness. A crushing weight pressed down on her, pinning her legs, stealing her breath. The air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, the sharp, clean scent of splintered pine, and another, warmer smell, coppery and metallic, that she vaguely recognized as her own blood. Pain, sharp and blinding, flared in her left leg. She tried to move, but she was pinned fast, trapped within the tomb of her ruined wagon. Silas had been watching the storm's approach from a small bluff, a high vantage point that gave him a clear view of the plains. He had seen the wagon master's futile attempt to reach shelter, had seen the chaos erupt as the deluge hit. He was a figure of calm competence amidst the unfolding panic. When he saw the Vance wagon slide and then disappear over the edge of the ravine, He spurred his horse into motion, guiding the buckskin expertly down the treacherous, muddy slope. He rode through the wreckage, his gaze sharp and focused, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. The body of the driver lay twisted near a broken wheel. A little farther on, he saw the still form of the man's wife, half buried in the mud. He dismounted, moving with a purpose that stood in stark contrast to the storm's senseless violence. It was then that he heard it, a faint, guttural sound, more a gasp of pain than a cry for help, coming from beneath the largest section of the overturned wagon. He worked with a desperate, focused strength. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle, looping it around a solid-looking axle. He tied the other end to his saddle horn and urged his horse forward. The buckskin, well-trained and steady, dug its hooves into the mud and pulled. Wood groaned, and the wreckage shifted, just enough. Silas secured the rope and dropped to his knees, peering into the dark, cramped space he had created. He saw her then. A pale face, streaked with mud and blood, framed by a tangle of dark hair. Her fine traveling dress, a deep blue silk that must have cost a fortune in Philadelphia, was torn and ruined. Her eyes, wide with terror and pain, found his in the gloom. He saw her leg, trapped at a terrible angle beneath a heavy, splintered timber. Without a word, he began to crawl under the wreckage toward her. The space was tight, forcing him onto his belly. The smell of wet earth and her blood was stronger here. He worked to free her, his hands testing the weight of the timber, his mind calculating angles and leverage. His face was inches from hers, so close he could feel the warmth of her ragged breaths on his cheek. It was in this cramped, dark space, with the rain still drumming on the canvas above them, that the first major emotional climax occurred. She began to weep. He saw the tears well up in her eyes and trace clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He paused, assuming they were tears of relief, the natural response of a person snatched from the jaws of death. He was about to offer some useless, comforting words when she spoke, her voice a raw, broken whisper that cut through the sound of the storm. "You shouldn't have saved me." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stopped, his hands still on the timbers that trapped her. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Past the fear and the pain, he saw in her eyes a despair so profound, so absolute, it eclipsed everything else. It was the look of a soul that had given up, that had seen the crash not as a tragedy, but as a release, an escape from a fate she dreaded more than death itself. Silas did not ask why. He did not offer the false comfort of a man who did not understand. He simply held her gaze, his own haunted eyes, which had seen their own share of inconsolable loss, acknowledged her pain on a primal, unspoken level. He had no words for her, for what words were there for such a bottomless grief? But in the silent, profound connection of that look, something passed between them, a shared understanding of suffering, a communion of two broken people trapped in the wreckage of their lives. The moment stretched, suspended in the darkness. Then, he broke the gaze and returned to his work. His movements were different now, no less firm or efficient, but infused with a gentleness that had not been there before. He found his leverage, and with a great, straining effort, he shifted the timber just enough. He reached for her, his arms sliding around her waist, and carefully, deliberately, he pulled her free. He dragged her out from under the wreckage into the cold, driving rain. The storm was beginning to abate, the thunder now a distant rumble, the downpour softening to a steady drizzle. He looked up toward the trail. It was empty. The wagon train, in its desperate flight for shelter, had moved on. They were utterly, completely alone in the vast, devastated landscape. The dawn came not with color but with a slow dilution of the darkness. A watery, gray light crept over the horizon, revealing a world scoured clean by the storm, a landscape of raw mud and splintered debris. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale, indifferent disk in a washed-out sky. It offered no warmth, only the promise that the mud would soon bake and crack and turn back into the dust that was its natural state. The silence was the most unsettling thing. After the fury of the storm, The profound and unnerving quiet felt like a presence. The only sound was the mournful sigh of the wind as it ghosted through the sagebrush, a lonely whisper in a dead world. Near the skeletal remains of the wagon, two shapes lay beneath a salvaged piece of canvas. Silas had covered the driver and his wife that morning, a simple, final act of respect. Their journey was over. Ilara sat propped against a wagon wheel that had been torn from its axle, a coarse wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her left leg, crudely but effectively splinted with splintered floorboards and strips of her own petticoat, throbbed with a dull, insistent fire. The physical pain, however, was a distant echo compared to the disorienting sense of shame that churned within her. She had survived. In the moment of the crash, she had felt a flicker of something terrifyingly close to hope, the hope of an ending. Now, in the bleak light of morning, she was alive, and the people who had been charged with her care were dead. The guilt was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She had wished for oblivion, and the universe, in its cruel irony, had granted it to others. While she was lost in the fog of her shock, Silas moved with a quiet, methodical purpose. He was not a man who wasted motion or sentiment. He was a creature of pragmatism, and their situation was a problem to be solved, one piece at a time. He moved through the wreckage like a scavenger, his eyes assessing, calculating. His quiet competence was a world away from Ilara's helpless inertia. She watched him, a stranger who had pulled her from the earth, as he worked to piece together the means of their survival from the ruins of her life. He found a crate of tinned beef and hardtack that had been wedged, miraculously unbroken, between two larger chests. He righted a water barrel, sloshing it to confirm it was still nearly full, its contents a treasure more valuable than gold. From her own trunk, which had burst open, scattering its contents across the mud, he salvaged a small medical kit, a few thick blankets, and a bar of lavender soap, which he handled with an odd sort of reverence before wrapping it in a piece of cloth. Ilara watched him, her initial fear of this lone, silent man slowly being replaced by something else. It was not trust, not yet, but a grudging and absolute reliance. He was a mystery, a man who had appeared out of the wilderness and now held her life in his calloused hands. He was her only lifeline in a world that had been violently stripped down to its most basic elements: earth, sky, and the will to live. The first days of their journey were a trial of silence. The vast, empty wilderness that stretched before them was a perfect mirror of the emotional distance between them. They moved north, Silas having decided that following the wagon train was a fool's errand. They were days behind, and he knew a more direct route to the settlements that lay in the shadow of the mountains. Their communication was stripped to the bone, a language of pure necessity. "We need to find better shelter before nightfall. Drink this. You are not drinking enough. Can you stand on the other leg? I need to adjust the splint." Ilara would nod or whisper, "Yes," her voice feeling rusty and foreign in her own throat. Most of the time, she simply watched the horizon, the searing pain in her leg a constant, agonizing rhythm with every jolt of the horse. The world had become a blur of sensory details: the flat, dusty taste of the hardtack he made her eat, the sharp, medicinal scent of the salve he applied to her cuts, the profound, bone-deep chill of the desert night that seeped through their blankets. To travel at all, she had to ride his horse. There was no other way. This forced upon them a physical proximity that was both deeply uncomfortable and strangely grounding. Silas would swing into the saddle, then reach down and lift her, his movements efficient and impersonal, as if he were hoisting a sack of flour. He would settle her in front of him, her back pressed firmly against the solid wall of his chest. For Ilara, who had been raised in a world of chaste distances and formal gestures, the intimacy was jarring. She was acutely aware of everything about him: the warmth of his body that soaked through her thin dress, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her shoulder blades, the faint scent of leather, wood smoke, and the clean sweat of a man who worked hard. She felt the flex of his muscles as he controlled the horse, the solidness of his presence a constant, living thing behind her. Silas, for his part, was just as aware of her. He was a man accustomed to a solitary existence, and the fragility of the woman in his arms was a constant, unsettling reminder of a world he had long since left behind. He could feel the slight tremor in her hands where they rested on the saddle horn, a vibration of fear and exhaustion that traveled up his own arms. He was aware of the scent of rain and lavender that clung to her dark hair, a fragrance so out of place in this harsh landscape that it felt like a memory of another life. This forced closeness began to do what words could not. It began to wear away at the edges of their isolation, creating a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of their shared humanity. The silence was finally broken one evening, 4 days into their journey. They had made camp in the lee of a rock outcropping that offered some protection from the incessant wind. The sun had set, leaving behind a bruised purple sky that bled into a riot of stars. Silas had built a small fire, and its flickering light cast long, dancing shadows around them. He was changing the dressing on her leg, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such rough hands. He had just unwrapped the bandages when a fresh wave of pain, white-hot and blinding, lanced up her leg. A choked gasp escaped her lips, and then the dam broke. It was not a quiet, dignified weeping. It was a storm of convulsive, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The pain in her leg was merely the trigger. She wept for the driver and his wife, for the life she had lost, for the gilded cage that awaited her, and for the terrifying, unknown wilderness that stretched between here and there. She wept for the simple fact that she was utterly, hopelessly alone. Silas froze, his hands hovering over her injured leg. He looked up at her, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. A different man might have offered platitudes, might have said, "There, it will be all right." Silas did not. He seemed to understand that her grief was a wild, untamable thing that could not be soothed with empty words. He did not speak. Instead, he stopped his work and rested a hand on her shoulder. It was not a pat or a squeeze. It was a simple, solid weight. A gesture of quiet, unshakable presence that communicated more than any sentence ever could. It said, "I am here." It said, "I see this." He just held it there, his calloused palm a point of anchor in her swirling sea of despair. He waited, patient and silent, until the storm of her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths. Only then did he remove his hand and quietly, efficiently, finish dressing the wound. After that night, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a wall, but a space that could, on occasion, be bridged. They began to talk, their conversations as tentative and cautious as a deer approaching a stream. "Where did you come from?" she asked one afternoon, her voice still raspy. Silas was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "Here and there," he said finally. His answer clipped. "Worked on ranches, Texas, up to Montana." It was an answer that was not an answer. His past was a locked room, and he had no intention of giving her the key. He turned the question on her. "What about you, Philadelphia?" She expected him to be impressed by the name of the city, by the society she had come from. Instead, he simply waited, his expression neutral. A surprising bitterness rose in her throat. "Philadelphia," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth, "is a city of appearances. It is a place where what you have is more important than who you are, where a good name is a currency that can be spent, and once it is gone, you are worth nothing." She found herself telling him about her family's collapse, explaining the situation with Mr. Finch, not with self-pity, but with the flat, dispassionate tone of a witness describing an accident. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady, and for the first time, she felt as though someone was hearing the truth of her situation, not just the polite fiction her family had constructed. The land, however, was not finished testing them. Their water barrel began to run low. What had been a life-sustaining comfort became a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. Silas rationed the water, giving Alara the larger share, but each sip was a reminder of their dwindling supply. The sun seemed to sense their vulnerability, beating down with a renewed, relentless intensity. The landscape shimmered with heat, and the air was thin and dry. Ilara grew weak. A fever took hold, born of her injury and the dehydration. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, and she drifted in and out of a hazy, delirious state. Through it all, Silas pushed on, his face a grim mask of determination. He would scan the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare, searching for the telltale line of green that might signal a creek bed, the cluster of rocks that might hide a spring. Their shared trial, this desperate search for the most basic element of life, forged a bond between them stronger than any conversation. They were no longer just a man and a woman, they were a single unit, fighting a common enemy. He found it when Ilara had all but given up, when her world had shrunk to a pulsating haze of pain and thirst. A small, hidden spring, tucked away at the base of a stony hill, its presence marked by a patch of impossibly green ferns. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, it felt like a religious experience. Silas slid from the horse, his movements urgent. He did not drink himself. He cupped his hands in the cool, clear water and brought them to her lips. "Ilara, drink," he said, his voice rough. The water was the sweetest, most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was the taste of life itself. He brought her more, his cupped hands a tender, life-giving vessel, until she had had her fill. The simple, selfless act touched a place deep inside her that she thought had died. That night, a cold wind swept down from the north, forcing them to seek more substantial shelter. Silas found a small, shallow cave carved into the side of a butte, just big enough for the two of them and a small fire, huddled together under a single blanket. They watched the flames cast dancing, primeval shadows on the stone walls. The cold and the darkness created a new kind of intimacy, a sense of being the only two people left in the world. In the quiet, with the wind whistling outside, Ilara found the courage to ask him again. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "why do you travel alone?" He was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire, his profile hard and sorrowful in the golden light. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion he could no longer completely hide. "I had a place once," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "A small ranch, down near the Cimarron." He paused, and she could feel the weight of what he was not saying. "It was my own place." He did not speak of the family he had lost there, of the wife and son who had been the heart of that place. He did not tell her of the violence that had taken them, or of the guilt that had driven him into this solitary, wandering penance. But the pain of it was there, raw and unmistakable in the timbre of his voice. This partial confession, this small, cracked open window into his locked-up past, was a profound act of trust, more intimate than any touch. Listening to him, Ilara realized that his loneliness was not the same as hers. Hers was the loneliness of being trapped, of being unseen. His was the loneliness of profound and irrevocable loss. Her heart ached for him, not with pity, but with a deep, shuddering empathy, instinctively, without thought. She reached out from under the blanket and placed her hand on his forearm. His muscles tensed at her touch, but he did not pull away. They sat there for a long time in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Her hand rested on his arm, a small point of contact in the vast, cold darkness. Their shared sorrows, his unspoken, hers now understood, created a powerful, unspoken connection in the flickering firelight. They were two broken souls, finding a fragile, temporary shelter in each other. In the weeks that followed, the sharp, desperate edge of survival began to soften into something else, a rhythm of existence that was almost peaceful. The land, which had been their adversary, became their provider, and they learned its cadences. They fell into a routine dictated not by a clock but by the sun and their own shared needs. This new life was a kind of temporary, fragile domesticity, built in the vast, silent wilderness. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and slip out with his rifle to hunt or check the snares he had set. He had a hunter's instinct, a deep, ingrained knowledge of the land that felt as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He would return with a rabbit or a pair of grouse, and the sight of him emerging from the morning mist, his quiet competence a solid, reassuring presence, became the anchor of Alara's day. Her leg, though still weak, was healing. The sharp, debilitating pain had subsided into a persistent ache, and with a sturdy branch for a crutch, she found she could manage the tasks of their small, nomadic camp. While Silas was gone, she would tend the fire, her hands, once accustomed to the delicate touch of piano keys, growing calloused from gathering wood and handling hot stones. She learned to mend the tears in their clothes with a needle salvaged from her sewing kit, her stitches growing surer and straighter with each passing day. She prepared their meals over the open flame, learning the simple alchemy of turning Silas's hunt into a savory stew that fought back the chill of the evening. This division of labor, this shared work of living, created a semblance of a life together. It was a partnership born of necessity, but it felt more real, more honest than anything Alara had ever known. She would watch him skin a rabbit with swift, economical movements, and he would watch her grind their dwindling supply of coffee beans between two flat rocks. In these quiet moments of shared purpose, a world was being built between them, a stark and simple contrast to the ornate, empty life that awaited her in Redemption Bluff. The tension between them, once a current of unspoken grief and shared hardship, now flowed in a different direction. It became an undeniable presence, a charge in the air that was as tangible as the scent of pine after a rain. It was in the small, unguarded moments. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her face when she was staring into the fire, a look of such profound and gentle intensity that it made her feel seen for the first time in her life. It was in the way her own breath would catch in her throat when he came to adjust the blanket around her shoulders, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck for a fleeting, electric second. The vast, empty landscape that surrounded them became a sanctuary for these burgeoning feelings. With no one to watch, no society to judge, their connection was allowed to grow in a way that was pure and unadorned. They were Adam and Eve in a harsh, beautiful Eden, their world defined only by the horizon and each other. Their conversations deepened, flowing from the practical to the personal. They no longer spoke only of water and shelter. They spoke of small, simple things that revealed the people they had been before their lives had been broken. "My mother," Alara confessed one night, smiling at a memory, "used to make a lemon cake with powdered sugar. When I was a girl, I was certain it was what angels ate in heaven." Silas, in turn, offered a piece of himself. "My father taught me the names of the stars. He said a man who could read the stars would never truly be lost." He pointed with his chin toward the glittering spray of the Milky Way. He called that the Great Sky River. These simple exchanges were freighted with unspoken meaning. When she spoke of lemon cake, he heard the story of a childhood filled with a love and comfort he could barely imagine. When he spoke of the stars, she heard the echo of a boy who had been given a map to the world by a father he had loved. They were slowly, carefully, handing each other the broken pieces of their pasts, trusting the other to hold them gently. The peace was shattered on an afternoon when the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. Silas, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, suddenly went still. His head came up, his body taming a posture of absolute, predator-like alertness. Alara had been dozing in the warm sun, and the abrupt shift in his demeanor sent a jolt of fear through her. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the low ridge to the south. "Get behind the rocks," he said, his voice low and devoid of all warmth. "Do not make a sound, and do not come out, no matter what you hear." She saw it then. 2 riders, dark figures cresting the ridge, moving with a lazy, confident slouch that was not the way of honest men. Silas had sensed them long before she had seen them, his instincts honed by a life of paying attention. Terror, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled behind the cluster of boulders he had indicated, her heart hammering against her ribs. The 2 men rode into the camp as if they owned it. They were gaunt, their faces obscured by grime and unshaven beards, their clothes little more than rags. They looked like vultures drawn to a carcass, and Alara realized with a sickening certainty that they must have seen the wagon wreckage and followed their trail, believing them to be easy prey, survivors with money or valuables. Silas stood to meet them, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His body relaxed in a way that seemed more dangerous than any overt threat. "That's far enough," he said, his voice calm and even. The lead rider, a man with cruel, piggy eyes, grinned, revealing a row of broken, yellowed teeth. "Well now, look what we have here. Just taking a little rest, are we? We saw the mess you left back down the trail. Figured you might have salvaged something worth sharing." "There is nothing here for you," Silas said, his voice flat. "Keep riding." The second man, lankier and more nervous, let his hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. "We will be the judge of that. We will just take a look around, and we will take that rifle." The confrontation was not a heroic, drawn-out duel from a dime novel. It was a swift, brutal, and terrifyingly messy explosion of violence. As the second man's hand closed around his pistol, Silas moved. He was not just fast, he was economical, a blur of deadly purpose. He fired the rifle from his hip, the blast echoing through the canyon. The lanky man was thrown backward off his horse, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Before the first man could even react to his partner's fall, Silas had dropped the rifle and drawn his pistol. The man with the piggy eyes let out a roar of rage and spurred his horse forward, drawing his own weapon. It was a desperate, clumsy charge. Silas did not aim for the man, but for the horse. His shot was precise. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and collapsed, pinning its rider's leg beneath its great weight. Silas was on him in an instant. It was not a gunfight now, but a desperate, grunting struggle for life. The man thrashed, trying to bring his pistol to bear, but Silas was on top of him, his face a mask of cold, grim fury. Alara watched in horror from behind the rocks. She saw the flash of a knife, heard a choked, wet gasp, and then a final, shuddering sigh. The struggle was over. Silas rose, his breathing heavy, and the second outlaw, the one who had charged him, lay still. Alara then realized Silas had not shot the charging man, but had wounded him. He was groaning, trying to free his leg. Silas walked over, his face grim, and pointed his pistol. The man's eyes went wide. "Please," he whimpered. Silas stared at him for a long moment, then fired a single shot into the dirt beside his head. "Get out of here," he growled, "and don't ever let me see you again." The wounded man, sobbing, scrambled to free himself and hobbled away as fast as he could, disappearing over the ridge. The aftermath was a silence more profound and terrible than any that had come before. Silas stood over the body of the man he had killed, not in triumph, but in a state of shock. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his entire body. He looked at the blood on his hands with an expression of such profound self-loathing that it horrified Alara. He turned away, walking to the edge of the camp, and was violently ill. That night, the mood by the fire was heavy and dark. Silas had buried the dead man without a word, his movements stiff and mechanical. Now he sat staring into the flames, a wall of ice around him. He was withdrawn, unreachable, lost in a place she could not go. The deadly efficiency with which he had protected them had been replaced by the brokenness of a man haunted by the violence he was capable of. Finally, in the deep quiet of the night, he broke. "He was no older than my Daniel," he whispered, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "Daniel?" she asked softly. The question was the key that unlocked the final door to his past. The violence of the day had unearthed the trauma he had kept buried for so long, and now it came pouring out of him, a torrent of grief and guilt that he could no longer contain. "My son," he said, his voice cracking. He told her everything then, the words tumbling out, rough and raw with pain. He told her about his wife, Maria, a woman with hair as black as a raven's wing and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow. He told her about their son, Daniel, a boy of 7 with his mother's laugh and a stubborn streak that was all his own. He spoke of their small ranch, the place he had built with his own 2 hands, the piece of the world that had been their heaven. And then he told her how it had ended. He had gone into town for supplies, a trip that should have taken a day. He had been delayed, a broken wagon wheel. When he returned, he had seen the smoke from miles away. He found his home a smoldering ruin. Cattle rustlers, he learned later, had hit several ranches in the area. Maria and Daniel were gone, taken by the fire and the senseless violence. His voice broke completely. "I was not there," he choked out, the words ripped from his soul. "I should have been there. I was in town, fixing a wheel, while they... He could not finish. The guilt was an all-consuming fire, a poison he had lived with for years. He saw his absence not as a misfortune, but as an unforgivable sin. His life since that day had not been a life at all, but a penance. He had been drifting, unable to settle, unable to build, unable to forgive himself for the crime of surviving. Ilara's heart did not break for him. It expanded, making room for his colossal pain. She saw past the stoic, capable cowboy to the shattered man beneath. She saw a man crucified by a memory, and her soul ached for him, not with pity, which would have been an insult, but with a profound, bone-deep empathy. She moved closer to him, her own aches and fears forgotten. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the faint, silvery scar on his temple she had noticed so many times before. He flinched at her touch, but did not pull away. "It was not your fault, Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet night. "You could not have known. What happened was a terrible, wicked thing, but it was not your fault." He looked at her then, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and in that moment of raw, unguarded vulnerability, she gave him a piece of her own brokenness in return. "They made me feel worthless," she said, her voice thick with a shame she had never spoken aloud. "My own family. They looked at me and saw not a daughter, but a commodity, a thing to be sold to save the family name. I was so ashamed. I wished for the wagon to crash. I wished to die. That is a shame I will carry forever." In that moment, by the flickering firelight, they were no longer a man and a woman. They were 2 broken souls, stripped bare of all pretense, offering their deepest wounds to each other. His tragedy and her shame met in the space between them, and in that meeting, they forged a bond that was stronger than steel, a connection born of the deepest kind of human understanding. The raw, aching honesty of their confessions had changed the air between them. The tension, the longing, the unspoken feelings that had been simmering for weeks, now had nowhere left to hide, driven by a force that was as old and inevitable as the turning of the earth. He reached for her. It was not a planned or seductive moment. It was a collision, an inevitable and desperate coming together of need, comfort, and a love that had been forged in the crucible of tragedy. He pulled her to him, his hands tangling in her hair, and his mouth found hers. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, and filled with all the pain and longing they had kept suppressed for so long. It was the taste of salt from their tears, the scent of wood smoke, and the feeling of coming home after a lifetime of exile. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a silent vow made in the heart of the wilderness. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bedroll he had laid out by the fire. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. What happened next was not an act of passion, but an act of grace. It was a search for human connection in a cruel and unforgiving world. It was tender and slow and healing. A quiet, profound exploration of 2 people who had been lost and were now, finally, found. They were not just taking comfort, they were giving sanctuary. In each other's arms, they were redefined, reborn not as the sum of their tragedies, but as 2 people who had found a reason to live in the touch and taste and soul of another. As they continued their journey in the days that followed, everything was different. They were no longer just a man and a woman surviving together. They were in love. They both knew it, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath their feet. But they did not speak of it. To give it a name, to say the words aloud, felt dangerous, as if it would call the attention of the cruel world they were so close to rejoining, the specter of redemption. Bluff and Mr. Alistair Finch, which had faded into a distant abstraction during their time in the wilderness, now loomed larger and more ominous with every mile they traveled. Their small, private world, so perfectly and perilously built, was threatened. They began to see the signs of civilization, the scars of progress on the face of the land. A distant plume of smoke from a chimney stack, cutting a dirty line into the clean blue sky, the ruts of a well-traveled road, a sign that other people, with their rules and judgments, were near. The idyllic chapter of their journey was ending. The harsh reality of the world they had fled, the world Ilara was being delivered to, was about to begin. They crested a low rise, and the world changed. The vast, profound silence of the wilderness was shattered, replaced by a cacophony that assaulted the senses. After weeks of hearing nothing but the wind, the cry of a hawk, and the soft sound of their own breathing, the noise of Redemption Bluff was a physical blow. It was the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the sharp retort of a saw biting into fresh lumber, the rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on a hard-packed street, and a chaotic symphony of human voices, shouting, laughing, arguing, bargaining. The town was a place of jarring and violent contrasts, a testament to the raw, ambitious speed with which it had been clawed from the wilderness. Imposing, newly constructed buildings of brick and milled lumber, with false fronts that reached for the sky, stood shoulder to shoulder with ramshackle saloons and lean-to shacks made of unplaned boards. A grand hotel with glass windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, its respectable porch looking out over a main street that was little more than a river of mud in some places and a choking expanse of dust in others. Redemption Bluff was a town desperately trying to impose order on the wild, but the facade was thin, and the untamed country bled through at every seam. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. They rode down the main street on Silas's buckskin, a single, weary entity, and it felt as if every window and doorway suddenly contained a pair of watching eyes. A hush fell over the boardwalks as they passed. Women in tightly laced corsets and starched bonnets stopped their chatter, their gazes sharp and disapproving. Men in bowler hats and vested suits paused, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Ilara felt the weight of their judgment like a physical shroud. She was acutely aware of her appearance, her dress, once a fine navy silk, now patched with coarse sacking and stained with the memory of their journey, her hair, a tangled mess tucked beneath a faded scarf, her face burned by the sun and etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Beside her, or rather, behind her, Silas was a figure from another, wilder world, rugged, armed, and covered in the dust of the trail. He was the embodiment of everything these townspeople sought to tame or eradicate. The social prejudice of the civilized world, a world Ilara had once navigated with effortless grace, descended upon them with the swift, merciless certainty of a hawk striking its prey. She, who had once been admired in the parlors of Philadelphia, was now just trail trash, tainted by her association with the rough-looking man who held her. The sting of it was sharper and more painful than she could have ever imagined. They found the offices of the Finch Land Mercantile Company in the most impressive building in town, a 2-story brick structure that spoke of permanence and power. The name was painted in elegant gold leaf on the large plate-glass window, leaving Silas with the horse. Ilara pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The man who rose from behind a massive mahogany desk was not what she had expected. In her mind, Mr. Alistair Finch had been a vague, shadowy figure, likely stout and balding, with the soft hands of a man who dealt only in paper and coin. The man before her was handsome, almost impeccably so, and likely in his late 40s. His dark hair was threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, and his suit was tailored from expensive black wool. He exuded an aura of immense power and absolute, unshakable control. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "Mr. Finch," she managed to say, her own voice sounding small and rough in the quiet, orderly office. His eyes swept over her, a quick, almost imperceptible inventory of her disheveled state. For a brief, unguarded moment, A flash of pure, undiluted annoyance crossed his handsome features. It was the look of a man who had purchased a prize thoroughbred and had it delivered covered in mud and burrs. Then, just as quickly, the expression was gone, replaced by a mask of deep, concerned benevolence. "My dear child," he said, rounding the desk and taking her hands in his. His grip was cool and firm. "You are safe. I was beginning to fear the worst." He gestured toward the door, where Silas now stood, a silent, watchful presence in the doorway. Finch's gaze passed over him, through him, as if he were a piece of furniture or a stray dog that had wandered in from the street. There was not even a flicker of acknowledgement. He was utterly, completely dismissed. "You must tell me everything," Finch continued, his focus entirely on Alara. "But later. You are exhausted." Silas stepped forward then, his boots quiet on the polished floorboards. The air in the office grew tense, the silence charged with unspoken challenges. Finch finally deigned to look at him, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if noticing a stable hand who had overstepped his bounds. "Thank you for your service," Finch said, his tone dripping with condescension. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a few silver coins, holding them out between his thumb and forefinger as if offering a treat to an animal. "For your trouble." Silas did not look at the money. His cold gray eyes were fixed on Finch's face. "I do not want your money," he said, his voice low and steady. He then looked at Alara, a silent, meaningful glance that was an entire conversation in itself. Returning his gaze to Finch, he stated, simply, "I brought her here, as I said I would." The unspoken meaning hung in the air between them. "I did not do it for you. I did it for her." Finch's pleasant mask tightened, the muscles around his jaw hardening. He gave a small, humorless smile and asserted his ownership with a single, decisive gesture. He placed a proprietary hand on Alara's arm, his fingers closing around her bicep, and began to guide her toward a side door. "Yes, well, your service is concluded," he said, his voice retaining its smooth veneer but with an underlying edge of steel. "Miss Vance is my concern now." He pulled her through the door, effectively separating them, leaving Silas standing alone in the center of the opulent office. Finch's home was the largest in Redemption Bluff, a white two-story house that sat on a small hill overlooking the town, a monument to its owner's prosperity. Inside, it was a museum of expensive, untouched things. The furniture was dark, heavy, and polished to a mirror shine. Intricate carpets muffled every footstep. The air was still and cool, smelling faintly of lemon oil and a distinct lack of life. It was a house that was meticulously kept but not lived in, a sterile, cold showcase for a man's wealth. A severe-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a merciless bun introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She was assigned to Alara, her presence a constant, silent surveillance. Alara was escorted to a large, beautifully appointed bedroom upstairs. A hot bath was drawn for her in a copper tub, and laid out on the bed were new clothes, a dress of soft green muslin, delicate undergarments, and leather shoes. She was given fine food on delicate china, but every kindness felt like another bar being added to her cage. It was clear she was not a guest. She was a possession that had been delivered, and now she was being cleaned and polished for display. Finch spoke to her in that same condescendingly gentle tone, treating her like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and needed careful handling. "You must be exhausted and confused from your ordeal, my dear," he said to her that first evening in his formal dining room. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished table, the distance between them a vast, empty canyon. "We will not speak of it again, your association with a man like that." He paused, a flicker of distaste crossing his face. "Is an embarrassment, an unfortunate necessity of circumstance. We must now be very careful to manage the story, for the sake of our reputation." He smiled at her, a cool, proprietary smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your reputation." Silas, unable to bring himself to leave the town, found a small, clean room at the boarding house run by a kindly widow. He took a job at the livery stable, The familiar work of mucking out stalls and tending to horses a balm to his frayed nerves. It allowed him to remain close, to watch, and he quickly learned that in Redemption Bluff, he was a pariah. The story, subtly shaped and guided by Finch's influence, spread like a prairie fire. Silas Cole was not a savior. He was a drifter, an opportunist. He had found the girl after the crash. They whispered over fence posts and in the general store, and had taken advantage of her vulnerability. Some even suggested he had kidnapped her, holding her for some imagined ransom. Finch, meanwhile, was cast as the hero of the story, the powerful man who had reclaimed his bride-to-be from the clutches of a dangerous vagrant. Silas endured the open hostility, the suspicious glances, the way mothers pulled their children closer when he walked by. It was a familiar feeling, the loneliness of the outsider, but it was sharper now because it was undeserved. His only concern was Alara. He saw her once, riding in a fine carriage with Finch, looking pale and beautiful and terribly out of place. He spent his evenings watching the big white house on the hill, observing Finch's comings and goings, seeing the way the man moved through the town, a king in his own small kingdom. He saw the cold, calculating ambition beneath the charming exterior, and a knot of dread tightened in his gut. Inside the house, Alara was beginning to see it too. The mask of concerned benevolence began to slip, revealing the true nature of the man she was to marry. He was a creature of absolute control, obsessed with appearances. He corrected her speech if she used a turn of phrase he deemed too plain. "My dear, we must endeavor to be more precise," he would say with a thin smile. He criticized her posture, the way she held her fork, the way she met his gaze. He reminded her constantly, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, of the debt her family owed him. "I received a letter from your father today," he said one afternoon. "He is most grateful, as he should be. Their situation was precarious." The words were a silken chain, reminding her of her obligations, of the duty that shackled her to this cold, empty house, the final illusion shattered during a dinner of roasted chicken and imported wine. Finch was in a good mood, having just concluded a particularly profitable land deal. He spoke of it with a casual, chilling cruelty. "Peterson was a fool," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "He overextended, borrowed too much. I simply helped him see the inevitable. His ranch will make a fine addition to my holdings." He smiled then, a genuine smile of pure, predatory satisfaction. He was quite emotional about it. Some men have no stomach for business. A chill, colder than any winter wind in the wilderness, ran down Alara's spine. She looked at this handsome, sophisticated man and saw, with terrifying clarity, a monster. He did not just defeat his opponents, he enjoyed their ruin. This was the man she was supposed to marry, the man who would be the master of her life. The gilded cage did not just have bars, it had bars of ice, and they were closing in around her. The emotional climax came 2 weeks after her arrival. A dinner party was planned, a formal event to introduce her to the town's elite. The thought of being paraded before them, of smiling and making polite conversation while her soul was screaming, was more than she could bear. That afternoon, she feigned a headache, a recurring ailment from her ordeal. She claimed, "Mrs." Gable looked at her with suspicion but relayed the message to Finch, who accepted it with a tight-lipped nod. He could not, after all, have his prize exhibit looking unwell. As dusk settled over the town and the first carriages began to arrive at the house, Alara slipped out the back door. She moved through the shadows of the garden, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating defiance. She ran, her new shoes clumsy on the uneven ground, all the way to the livery stable at the far end of town. The stable was dark, the air thick with the warm, familiar scents of hay, horses, and well-oiled leather. It was the smell of her time with Silas, the smell of freedom. He was there, in the back, mending a harness by the light of a single lantern. He looked up as she entered, and his face, in the warm, flickering light, was a study in disbelief and raw, unadulterated joy. "Alara," he breathed, dropping the harness and moving toward her. The reunion was desperate, a collision of two people starved for the sight and touch of the other. They clung to each other, his arms a solid, protective circle around her, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. For a long moment, they just held on, drawing strength and comfort from the simple, solid reality of each other. "I knew you would come," he whispered into her hair. Then he pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers. "We have to leave. Now. Tonight. We can ride north, find a place where no one knows us. I can work. I can build us a life." His words were a torrent, a desperate plea. He was offering her the world. The only world that mattered. And it terrified her. The paralysis of fear, a fear she had not felt even when facing the outlaws, gripped her. The image of Finch's cold, smiling face, his casual cruelty, his immense power in this town, rose in her mind. "And go where, Silas?" she asked, her voice full of an anguish that tore at her own heart. "Live on what? We would be fugitives. He would hunt us. He is not a man who lets go of what he owns." The crushing weight of her duty, her family's fate hanging on this marriage, pressed down on her. "I cannot condemn you to a life on the run, or me to a life of nothing. The wilderness was one thing, but the world is not like that." The hurt in his eyes was a physical blow. "Is this life not a life of nothing?" he asked, his voice intense and low. "Freedom with nothing, Elara, is better than a prison of wealth. I would rather starve with you than watch you wither in that man's house." Their argument was a heartbreaking clash between his desperate, simple faith in their love and her complex, paralyzing fear. They were two people at the edge of a cliff, one begging the other to jump, the other terrified of the fall. She had no answer for him. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled away. "I must go back. They will notice." He did not try to stop her. The pain on his face was a silent testament to her indecision. She turned and fled, leaving him standing alone in the lantern light. As she slipped back into the suffocating silence of Finch's garden, she chanced to look up at the house. In an upstairs window, illuminated by the light from the hall, a shadow stood watching, a man's silhouette, still and ominous. He knew. The morning after her clandestine meeting with Silas, the atmosphere in the White House on the hill changed. The air, once merely cold and sterile, now felt brittle, charged with a menacing energy that seemed to emanate from Alistair Finch himself. The facade of kindness, the condescendingly gentle tone, the mask of the concerned benefactor, all of it had vanished. It had not cracked or crumbled. It had been deliberately removed, revealing the hard, cruel face of the man beneath. He summoned her to his study after breakfast. The room was dark, paneled in mahogany and smelling of old paper and cigar smoke. He was standing by the window, looking out over the town that was his personal kingdom. He did not turn when she entered. "You slept poorly, I imagine," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone, but with an edge she had not heard before. A guilty conscience can be a restless companion. Elara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She stood silently by the door, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. He turned then, a thin, chilling smile playing on his lips. "I saw you," he said simply. "I saw you run to him, to the stable boy, like a common trollop seeking a tryst in the hay." His words were not shouted. They were delivered with a quiet, precise cruelty, each one designed to cut. "I must admit, I am disappointed. I had thought your breeding would have instilled in you a greater sense of decorum, of loyalty." He walked to his large, ornate desk and sat down, gesturing for her to take the chair opposite him. It felt less like an invitation and more like a command. "Let us be clear with one another. Elara, there will be no more such excursions. There will be no more contact of any kind with that man." His smile widened, becoming something predatory. "If you ever try to see him again, if you ever do anything to publicly embarrass me or challenge my position, I want you to understand the consequences. I will not simply have him run out of town. I will destroy him. I will have him beaten so severely he will be lucky to walk again. and then I will see him charged with horse theft or some other crime that will ensure he spends the next 10 years rotting in a territorial prison. He will disappear so completely it will be as if he never existed." He paused, letting the weight of his threat settle upon her. "And then," he continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational whisper, "I will turn my attention to your family. I hold the notes on all their remaining debts. Your father's business associates in Philadelphia are also my associates. With a single telegram, I can have every one of those notes called in. I will see your father ruined, your mother turned out into the street. The shame that drove you into my arms will seem like a fond memory compared to the utter destitution I will visit upon them." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "You are my property, Elara. You were bought and paid for. Your family sold you, and I own you. You will be my wife. You will stand by my side, and you will do exactly as you are told. You will not defy me." To punctuate his declaration, he slowly opened a drawer in his desk. He did not look down. His eyes remained locked on hers as he withdrew a small, elegant pistol with a pearl handle. It was a beautiful, deadly thing. He placed it on the polished surface of the desk between them, letting it catch the light from the window. He did not point it at her. He did not have to. The implied threat, the cold, metallic promise of what he was capable of, hung in the air, suffocating her. While Elara was being shackled in silken threats, Silas refused to be intimidated. The pain and fear he had seen in her eyes at the livery stable had hardened his resolve into something cold and sharp. He knew he could not challenge Finch with his fists or his gun. Finch owned the town, the law, and everything in it. Justice, if it was to be found, would have to be a different kind of weapon. He worked at the livery, keeping his head down but his ears open. A stable was the crossroads of a town, a place where men talked freely while their horses were being shod, where gossip and business mixed with the smell of manure and hay. He began to piece together the truth of Alistair Finch's rise to power. He heard whispers of ranchers who had taken loans from Finch's mercantile, only to find the terms changing, the interest compounding, until the debt became an inescapable trap. He heard stories of land grabs, of water rights mysteriously rerouted, of families who had worked their land for a generation, suddenly finding themselves foreclosed upon by the smiling, benevolent patriarch of Redemption Bluff. His search for a crack in Finch's armor led him to a man named Peterson. Silas had seen him in town, a stooped, broken figure with haunted eyes, who now eked out a living as a swampier in one of the saloons. It took Silas 3 days to get the man to speak to him, 3 days of quiet, patient approaches that finally broke through Peterson's wall of terror. They met in a secluded spot by the creek at the edge of town. Peterson, his hands shaking, told Silas his story. He had owned one of the finest ranches in the valley. A bad winter, a cattle plague, and he had been forced to take a loan from Finch. Finch had been a savior, at first, then the pressure started, a second ledger, a different set of numbers, and suddenly Peterson was ruined, his land and livestock forfeited to cover a debt he could no longer understand. "He is the devil himself," Peterson whispered, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "He smiles while he signs the papers that slit your throat." "Can you prove it?" Silas asked, his voice low and urgent. Peterson hesitated, his fear warring with a lifetime of resentment. Finally, with a trembling hand, he reached inside his worn coat and pulled out a thin, leather-bound book. "I was his clerk for a time, before he took my land. I was supposed to burn this. The real ledger. It shows the true numbers, the ones before he doctored them for the courts." He pushed the book into Silas's hands. "He will kill me if he knows I kept it." "He will not get the chance," Silas said, his hand closing around the book. It was heavy, not with paper, but with the weight of stolen lives and broken dreams. It was the proof he needed. It was a weapon more powerful than his gun, back in her gilded cage. Elara felt herself suffocating. Finch's threats had closed in on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. The idea of a lifetime with this man, of being his possession, of smiling by his side while her soul withered and died, was a fate worse than any death she could imagine. The memory of the wagon crash returned to her with a startling, painful clarity. She remembered the feeling of utter hopelessness, the despair that had made her whisper, "You shouldn't have saved me." She had seen death as an escape then, an end to her obligations. She understood now, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Silas had not just saved her from the wreckage, he had saved her from giving up entirely. He had shown her a life of hardship and freedom, of pain and profound, healing love. He had shown her that she was worth more than her family's name, that she was not a commodity to be sold. Her love for him, a love born in the wilderness and now tested in the crucible of this town, had given her a strength she never knew she possessed. She made her decision. She would defy Alistair Finch. The consequences for her family would be dire, and the thought of it was a knife in her heart. But what life would she be saving for them by sacrificing her own? A life paid for with her soul, a life propped up by a monster. She would not do it. She would rather be ruined with the man she loved than be revered with the man she loathed. Her life was her own, and it was time to claim it. The town's Foundation Day picnic was the social event of the season, a public celebration where all of Redemption Bluff gathered to congratulate itself on its progress. Finch was the master of ceremonies, the town patriarch in his element. He stood on a newly built gazebo in the center of the town square, resplendent in a cream-colored suit, with Alara standing by his side like a prized statue. She wore a beautiful yellow dress he had chosen for her, a smile fixed on her face, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Finch made a grand, eloquent speech about prosperity, about the taming of the wild, about a future built on hard work and shared values. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. He was their leader, their benefactor, the architect of their good fortune. As he raised a hand to accept their adulation, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was Silas. He was calm, his face set with a grim determination. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace directly toward the gazebo. A murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of unease and anticipation. Finch's smile faltered. He gestured to two burly men standing near the steps of the gazebo, his hired muscle. "Remove that man," he commanded, his voice a low growl. But before they could move, Silas spoke, his voice clear and loud, carrying across the sudden silence of the square. "I have something to say about the prosperity of Redemption Bluff," he called out. "I want to talk about the prosperity of Alistair Finch and the price other men have paid for it." Finch's face went white with rage. "This man is a disgruntled drifter. Pay him no mind." Silas ignored him. He held up the leather-bound ledger book. "This book tells a story of fraud and theft. It tells the story of how men like Jacob Peterson were cheated out of their land." He scanned the crowd, his eyes finding the stooped, terrified figure of the former rancher. "Is it not so, Mr. Peterson? Tell them." The scene erupted into chaos. All eyes turned to Peterson, who stood trembling, a hunted animal caught in the light. He looked from Finch's murderous glare to Silas's steady gaze. A lifetime of humiliation and a flicker of desperate courage warred within him. He straightened his stooped shoulders and, in a shaky but clear voice, said, "It is true. He cheated us all." Finch's public image, the carefully constructed edifice of his entire life, shattered in that instant. He lost control completely. "Lies!" he shrieked, his voice shrill and unrecognizable. "All of it. Lies! This is a conspiracy concocted by a common vagrant who has poisoned this woman's mind against me." He turned on Alara then, his face a mask of pure fury. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Tell them," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Tell them he is a liar. Denounce him." This was her moment, the moment of truth she had been running from her entire life. In front of the entire town, with Silas's life and her own future hanging in the balance. She found her voice. She pulled her arm from Finch's vice-like grip. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was as clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning. She looked not at Finch, but at the stunned faces of the crowd. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "is not my savior. He is my jailer." Then she turned her eyes to Silas, a look of absolute, unwavering love and loyalty passing between them. "I choose him." The public humiliation was too much for Alistair Finch. A strangled, inhuman sound of rage escaped his throat. He was no longer a respected patriarch. He was an unhinged tyrant, exposed and cornered. He snapped. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the small, elegant pistol. The crowd screamed, a wave of panic sending people scattering in every direction. He aimed the pistol directly at Silas's heart. But before he could fire, Ilara reacted. It was not a thought. It was pure, primal instinct. With a cry, she shoved the heavy picnic table, laden with cakes and lemonade, directly into him. The table caught him in the legs, sending him stumbling backward. The shot went wild, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the wooden roof of the gazebo. What followed was not a duel. It was a desperate, chaotic brawl. Silas lunged, grabbing Finch's wrist and slamming it against a gazebo post until the pistol clattered to the floor. But Finch's hired men, the two thugs he had planted in the crowd, converged on Silas. One was a hulking brute, the other wiry and quick. Silas fought back with grim, deadly efficiency, his fists finding their mark, but he was outnumbered. The wiry man circled behind him, picking up a thick wooden plank that had been part of a dismantled stall. He raised it high, preparing to bring it down on the back of Silas's head. Ilara saw it happen. A scene from a nightmare. Her fear was eclipsed by a surge of pure, protective fury. She whirled around, her eyes landing on a nearby food stall. She grabbed the first thing her hand found, a heavy black cast-iron skillet. Without a second's hesitation, she swung it with all her might, bringing it down hard on the thug's forearm just as he began his downward blow. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the man screamed, dropping the plank and clutching his ruined arm. The moment of chaos was all they needed. Silas delivered a final, stunning blow to the larger man, then grabbed Ilara's hand. "Run!" They ran. They scrambled down from the gazebo and pushed their way through the panicked, screaming crowd. A shot rang out behind them. Finch had recovered his pistol. They did not look back. They raced down the main street, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them, their only thought the livery stable. They burst through the doors, Silas saddling his buckskin with frantic, practiced speed. He leaped into the saddle and pulled Ilara up behind him. They galloped out of the stable and out of the town, leaving Redemption Bluff and Ilara's past to disappear in a cloud of dust and chaos. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a future as uncertain as the wilderness that lay before them. But they were together, and they were free. They rode until the horse was slick with sweat and its breath came in ragged, heaving gasps. They rode until the sounds of Redemption Bluff, the shouts, the chaos, the echo of gunfire, were long swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. For hours, they did not speak, united in a desperate, forward flight, every nerve ending screaming with the expectation of pursuit. The thunder of their horses' hooves was the only sound in the world, a frantic drumbeat against the earth. Ilara clung to Silas, her face pressed into his back, the world a blur of sagebrush and sky. The wild, frantic energy of the escape, fueled by adrenaline and terror, could not last. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of blood and fire, a profound exhaustion settled over them, heavier than any blanket. The stark, cold reality of their situation began to seep into their bones. They were fugitives. They had nothing but the worn clothes on their backs, a single, spent horse, and the leather-bound ledger book tucked into Silas's saddlebag, a symbol of a justice that had no currency in this new, wild life. They had won their freedom, a glorious, terrifying, absolute freedom. But the cost of that freedom was everything they had ever known. Silas did not ride aimlessly. He pushed them north, into the broken country where the flat plains began to rise and crumble into the foothills of the mountains. It was a place he knew from his past, from the long years of drifting. Just as the last light faded from the sky and a sliver of moon rose to cast a pale, ghostly glow over the landscape, he led them into a narrow, hidden canyon. There, tucked into a stand of towering pines, was a small, dark shape. It was a long-abandoned line shack, built years ago by trappers and since forgotten by the world. It was little more than a one-room cabin, its log walls chinked with dried mud that had crumbled in places, its roof sagging, its single window a dark, vacant eye. It was dilapidated, exposed to the elements, a ghost of a shelter. But it was secluded, it was defensible, and it was safe. The landscape here was a world away from the sun-scorched plains. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. A nearby creek whispered over smooth stones, its sound a gentle music in the deep quiet. The rugged, timbered hills rose around them like protective walls, shutting out the rest of the world. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where the long arm of Alistair Finch could not reach. The immediate aftermath of their flight was a period of quiet, aching convalescence. Their bodies were bruised and scraped from the brawl, their spirits battered by the trauma. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of people in shock. They rarely spoke of what had happened in Redemption Bluff. The memory was a fresh, gaping wound, and words would only make it bleed. Instead, they turned their focus to the primal, immediate necessities of survival, and in that shared work, they began to lay the foundation of their new life. Silas, his face grim and set, tended to the horse, then used his knife to fashion a crude but effective patch for the most glaring hole in the cabin's roof. Ilara, her hands trembling, gathered pine needles for kindling and used the last of their matches to start a small, hesitant fire in the crumbling stone hearth. The first flicker of flame in the darkness of the cabin felt like a victory, a small, defiant spark against the overwhelming emptiness that surrounded them. In the days that followed, they worked from sunup to sundown, their shared labor a silent conversation. They were a team, their movements complementing each other with an unspoken understanding. Silas, using his belt axe, cleared the overgrown brush from around the cabin, creating a defensible clearing. Ilara, her fine muslin dress now permanently stained and torn, discovered a fierce, practical strength she never knew she possessed. She swept the packed earth floor clean of years of dust and debris and used clay from the creek bed to re-chink the walls, her once soft hands becoming calloused and capable. Together, they rebuilt the fireplace, carefully selecting and placing stones until it drew cleanly, its warmth a welcome blessing against the chill of the mountain nights. This period was where their love was truly tested, where it shed the skin of high-stakes drama and desperate survival and settled into something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more resilient. It was a love that existed not in grand declarations, but in the mundane, grace-filled moments of their shared existence. It was in the way he would return from checking his snares and silently place a single, vibrant blue wildflower on the rough-hewn table he had built for her. It was in the way she would sit by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration, stitching a tear in his worn shirt with thread pulled from the hem of her own petticoat. It was in the way they would share a meager meal of roasted rabbit, their hands brushing as they passed the single tin plate between them, a gesture of communion more profound than any prayer. They learned each other in this quiet, secluded world. They learned each other's rhythms, the comfortable patterns of their silences. They learned each other's strengths, his unshakable patience, her surprising fortitude. And they learned each other's fears, which they saw in the unguarded moments, in the way his eyes would sometimes go distant and haunted, or the way she would start at the sound of a falling branch, the echoes of Redemption Bluff still ringing in her ears. One evening, as they sat before the crackling fire, the weight of all that had been left unsaid finally became too heavy to bear. Ilara had been staring into the flames, her face a mask of sorrow. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and then another. She began to weep, not with the wild, convulsive sobs of her breakdown on the trail, but with a quiet, heartbreaking grief. Silas moved to her side, putting his arm around her, his solid presence a familiar anchor. He did not ask what was wrong. He knew. "My parents," she whispered, her voice thick with a sorrow that was laced with guilt. She was not weeping for the loss of the silks and the security, for the gilded cage she had so narrowly escaped. She was weeping for the two people whose love for her however flawed and misguided, had led them to this. My choice, what I did, it has likely condemned them. I saved myself, but I have ruined them. Silas held her, letting her cry, not offering the easy, empty comfort of false assurances. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply shared the weight of her sorrow, his silence and acknowledgement of the impossible choice she had been forced to make. When her tears finally subsided, he spoke, his voice low and rough with his own resurrected grief. For years, he began, his gaze fixed on the fire. Every sunrise was a punishment, another day to get through, another day to remember what I lost, what I failed to protect. He spoke of Maria and Daniel, his voice thick with the familiar pain. But the words were different this time. When I found you, under that wagon, and in the days after, for the first time since they died, I felt something other than the past. I felt a reason to look toward the next sunrise. You gave me that, Ilara. You gave me a reason to build a future, not just run from what is behind me. This shared vulnerability, this laying bare of their deepest wounds and fears, was the truest expression of their commitment. It was a vow made not before a preacher, but before a fire in the heart of the wilderness, a promise to carry each other's burdens, to be the keepers of each other's scars. The seasons turned, marking the passage of their new life. They endured a harsh, unforgiving winter, the cabin often buried in snow, the world outside a vast expanse of white. They were completely isolated, relying entirely on the wood Silas had cut, the meager supplies they had, and the steady, quiet comfort of each other's company. They learned that love could be a bulwark against the cold, a fire that warmed from the inside out. Spring arrived like a miracle, a slow greening of the world that felt like a personal promise of renewal and hope. As the snows melted, they cleared a small patch of land near the creek and planted a garden with seeds Silas had found in a forgotten pouch in his saddlebag. They tended the small green shoots with a fierce, parental devotion. That summer, Silas made a 2-week journey to a remote trading post, a full 100 miles to the north, a place where news of Redemption Bluff was unlikely to have traveled. He traded the furs he had trapped over the winter for essentials, salt, flour, coffee, and new seeds for their garden. He returned with not only supplies, but with news. A trapper, passing through, had spoken of Alistair Finch. The story of the Foundation Day picnic had indeed destroyed him, though he had faced no legal justice for his crimes. His public humiliation had been absolute. The town, having seen the tyrant behind the benefactor's mask, had turned on him. His power, which had been built on a foundation of respect and fear, had crumbled into dust. For a man like Finch, it was a punishment more complete than any prison sentence. The story of Ilara and Silas does not end with a promise of wealth or the discovery of a hidden gold mine. Their existence was hard. It was a daily struggle against the elements, a life of constant work for the smallest of rewards. The dark tragedies of their pasts had not magically disappeared. They were scars that they both carried, faint white lines on the landscape of their souls. But they were no longer the open, weeping wounds that had once defined them. They had healed. Their life was not easy, but it was a life they had chosen. Every single day, it was a life of freedom. The final scene is one of quiet, hard-won peace. It is a late summer evening, the air warm and smelling of pine and the rich earth of their garden. Ilara and Silas are sitting on the crude porch of their cabin, a porch he had built for her with his own hands. They are watching the sunset paint the jagged mountain peaks in brilliant, breathtaking hues of orange and purple. Ilara is mending a piece of clothing, her movements calm and practiced. Silas is cleaning his rifle, his hands sure and steady. There is a comfortable, unbreakable silence between them, the kind of silence that exists only between two people who know each other's hearts completely. He finishes his work, laying the rifle aside. He reaches over and takes her hand, his calloused, scarred palm fitting perfectly against hers. She stops her sewing and leans her head against his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. There are no grand declarations of love, no passionate vows whispered in the twilight. There is only a shared look, a deep and abiding understanding that they have found their home. It is not in the crumbling cities of the East or the ambitious, false-fronted towns of the West. It is not in a house or on a piece of land. They have found their home in each other, their love, born from a cry of despair beneath a fallen wagon, had become their shelter, their justice, and their reason for survival. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel to share your thoughts in English.